welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eunjung Cho. North Korea fired a solid-fuel intercontinental ballistic missile that could put the United States within range. The U.S. and South Korea are set to hold their first meeting of the Nuclear Consultative Group in the coming days. Today, we discuss the U.S. and South Korea's security strategy to counter the growing North Korean nuclear and missile threat.
평화와 안정을 위협하는 도발 행위이자 유엔 안보리 결의에 대한 명백한 위반입니다.
국際社会の平和と安全を脅かすものであり、強く非難いたします。
In the studio with me, Ambassador James Zumwalt, Chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Japan-America Society of Washington, D.C. Ambassador Zumwalt was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian Affairs and was also Ambassador to the Republic of Senegal and the Republic of Guinea-Bissau. Also joining us, Mr. Ankit Panda, Senior Fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Mr. Panda authored Kim Jong-un and the Bomb, Survival and Deterrence in North Korea. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Now, Mr. Panda, North Korea's Hwasong-18 ICBM reached a height of 6,600 kilometers and flew 1,000 kilometers for a record 74 minutes. Is this dramatic progress in North Korean missile technology?
Well, the test appears to have been a success, but I wouldn't necessarily describe it as a particularly dramatic success. I think North Korea has been developing long-range missiles. The reason we see these missiles flying to these incredibly high altitudes, several times higher than the International Space Station, is quite simply a fact of Northeast Asian geography. The North Koreans launched their missiles on these highly lofted trajectories, as they're called, launching a missile on a very sharp trajectory to shorten the range. They don't want to overfly Japan if they don't have to. And it also helps them ensure that they can maintain signals contact with the missile while it's flying so they can gather data and observe how the missile's engines are being flown. It is certainly the case, however, that the Hwasong-18 does appear to be an incredibly capable system that will contribute to North Korea's efforts to broadly augment its nuclear deterrence.
Some missile experts tell me that it is highly unbelievable that North Korea could achieve the apogee of 6,600 kilometers compared to 3,000 kilometers just 3 months ago. And their logic is that Hwasong-18 must be completely empty or have a post-boost system inside, which fire all the time as a fourth stage to reach that altitude. What is your take?
I don't necessarily think that the performance we've seen is that unbelievable in the current context. The Hwasong-18 was tested once before in April. According to North Korea's statement about that test, they actually tested that missile on a fairly unusual trajectory. They fired the first stage at a less lofted trajectory, later correcting the missile's trajectory to a more traditional North Korean ICBM launch. This time based on data released by North Korea, and I haven't seen anything contradictory released by South Korea and the United States, it does appear that this missile has been launched in a more optimal manner, which I think has resulted in this longer trajectory. You do raise an interesting point about the possibility of a so-called post-boost vehicle on the top of the missile. This is something I would expect to see North Korea develop in the coming months and years, given that Kim Jong-un has said that he does want to eventually deploy ICBMs with multiple warheads, and this is an important component of realizing that capability. However, I just don't see any evidence that the Hwasong-18 specifically appears to have a post-boost vehicle.
Ambassador Zumwalt, the U.S. condemned North Korea's ICBM launch and also called North Korea to return to dialogue. This is a consistent messaging from the United States to North Korea for a long time and didn't stop North Korea from further provocations. Now, famous quote is, if you keep on doing same things and expect different result, that's insanity. Is this the high time that the United States should consider more serious measures against North Korea?
Well, no, it's a very good question, and I think it's important to realize that the United States statements encouraging dialogue with North Korea have multiple audiences. One audience, obviously, is North Korea, and I don't think the United States government expects North Korea to change its assessments based on these statements. But the other audience is the world, and the United States wants the world to recognize that it's a reasonable actor, that it's willing to engage in diplomacy with North Korea, and it's the North Koreans who are refusing to engage. So that statement or that message asking for dialogue, I think, was effective in signaling to the rest of the world that the United States remains committed to a diplomatic solution to this challenge.
But don't you think the rhetoric must change a little bit because North Korea is not changing at all?
North Korea is not changing, and that's obviously very frustrating. But the challenge with diplomacy is it takes multiple parties to engage. The United States can't engage on its own. And so we certainly hope that North Korea will decide at some point the time has come to re-engage with the United States and try and seek solutions through dialogue.
Now, Mr. Panda, NATO summit was held in Vilnius, Lithuania this week, and South Korea and NATO deepened their bilateral partnership, signing on to individually tailored partnership program during the Vilnius summit. And in that partnership, they agreed to boost military information sharing and discuss South Korean forces joining in NATO-led military exercises. Now, why should South Korea, an Asian country, join forces with NATO? And what does it mean for South Korea's military projection?
Sure. So I think over the last couple of years, particularly since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there's broadly been a recognition in Northeast Asia, certainly in Japan. I think Prime Minister Kishida has been particularly explicit about this. But I think the South Korean government shares this view to an extent, that the theaters of Europe and Northeast Asia are in many ways interrelated. And security in one part of the world can't be entirely hermetically sealed off from dynamics in the transatlantic context in Europe. And so the AP4, the Asia-Pacific 4 partners of NATO, of which South Korea is one, I think are deepening their partnership according to that principle. NATO, of course, is treaty-bound to retain its geographic focus to the North Atlantic region. That is part of NATO's initial mandate that does remain in place. But I do think South Korea, Japan are going to continue to deepen their ties with NATO broadly as part of an endeavor to ensure that the rules-based international order that these countries depend on and value can be sustained as strongly as possible.
Ambassador Zumwalt, if South Korea engages in the European theater with the participation in the NATO-led military exercises, reversely, does that mean NATO will intervene in a crisis in Northeast Asia caused by North Korea or China?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to recognize that many of the member states of NATO have a presence on the Korean Peninsula. They're observers in the UN command, and therefore, for decades, many of NATO member countries have a very good understanding of Korean-U.S. doctrine for how we would respond in various kinds of scenarios. They've been observers at our bilateral exercises for years. So I see this step really as a recognition that Korea has a role to play like many NATO members do. This will result in Korea having a better understanding of NATO doctrine. I'm hopeful it will result in Korea seeing how the United States interacts with NATO partners. There may be some lessons learned or best practices that might help the U.S.-South Korea alliance as well. So I see it as very positive that Korea will gain a greater understanding of NATO doctrine. The second point I would make is right now, as many NATO members have contributed weapons to Ukraine, there's a need to rearm and restock supplies. And this is a real opportunity for Korea because Korea has a very good industry producing reasonably priced and very capable weaponry that is needed right now. So I think it's an important opportunity. The NATO nations are looking for these things, and Korea has capabilities. So I think it's very positive if Korea and NATO enhance their partnership in this supply issue.
And Mr. Panda, in last year's NATO's new strategic concept, NATO singled out China and Russia as their threats. And if South Korea joins in and more closely aligns with NATO's containment on Russia and China, what does South Korea get in return? Would NATO get more involved in deterring North Korean threat? What threat does North Korea pose to NATO, and what stakes does NATO have in solving the North Korean issue?
Well, so I think first of all, I think that NATO's ability to practically become militarily involved in a contingency in Northeast Asia or the Korean Peninsula will be limited. And I think that's a function of the alliance's traditional geographic scope. But that said, South Korea's involvement with NATO, I don't think is necessarily to be seen as a quid pro quo. I think South Korea is doing this out of its own interest in deepening its experience and expertise, learning from NATO, and it's a two-way exchange. Seoul, as we've seen over successive governments, progressive and conservative, is wrangling with its future in Asia, and particularly in dealing with China. There are longstanding concerns of Chinese economic coercion. South Korea understands that it does remain vulnerable potentially to retaliatory actions by China. And so Seoul, I think, would probably reject the characterization that it is signing up to some kind of initiative to contain China more broadly. But I think what South Korea is doing is it's maintaining its options. As a sovereign independent country, it has the right to engage with NATO as it sees fit to pursue its own national defense objectives. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing right now.
Ambassador Zumwalt, another big diplomatic event this week was ASEAN meetings, and one of the agenda there was North Korea's nuclear and missile activities. Now, those countries that are still involved in sanctions evasions are Southeast Asian countries. So how can we separate Southeast Asian countries from North Korea? Should the United States further utilize its economic statecraft to those facilitating countries?
This is a very important area for Korea, the United States, Japan, and other like-minded countries to work together using tools at our disposal, diplomacy, but also public diplomacy, perhaps economic steps, as you mentioned, to try and encourage and persuade countries in Southeast Asia to implement their obligations as UN members. I would add that I think Korea's new partnership with NATO presents an opportunity, because one area where Korea and NATO have agreed to work together is sharing intelligence information. And by Korea sharing its assessments of the threat from North Korea, this might raise awareness among NATO members about how important this is to their own security, and might encourage them to work with us in Southeast Asia to persuade countries in Southeast Asia to implement UN sanctions.
Now, Ambassador Zumwalt, the first round of nuclear consultative group will be held in Seoul in the coming days, and they will discuss information sharing, consultation mechanism, joint planning and execution designed to bolster nuclear deterrence against North Korea. Now, U.S. President has the sole authority over nuclear weapons. How does South Korea have any influence over the nuclear decision-making?
Well, I'm actually very excited about the nuclear consultative meetings that will occur next week, because I think this will bolster deterrence. It's important to keep in mind that there really are three sort of stages, if you will. The first is shaping the environment. The second is deterring potential adversaries, and the third is planning for potential responses to a nuclear attack. But it's important not to only focus on that third stage, but to look at the first and second stage. And by shaping the environment, what I mean is it's important for the United States and Korea to trust each other and to understand the U.S. commitments to South Korea. If South Korea has doubts about the strength of the U.S. commitment, that undermines our deterrence, because it means that North Korea might also decide perhaps they can get away with some provocative actions. So shaping the environment in the form of strengthening mutual trust is something that's very, very important to enhancing our deterrence. I think this meetings will be the beginning of an iterative process. The United States and Korea will be talking about various issues, and I think Korea will have plenty of opportunities to provide feedback if they have concerns about certain aspects of U.S. doctrine, and so they will have influence over this process over time. But it's going to be a long-term iterative process, but I think something that's a really important and new stage in strengthening our alliance.
But even if South Korea gets involved in the first and the second stage of setting the environment, at the end of the day, the third stage of making that decision of whether to use nuclear weapons, South Korea wouldn't have any influence, because that originally is on the U.S. president's authority.
Well, the decision to use nuclear weapons doesn't occur in a vacuum. There's a lot of planning and scenario building that goes into what happens when the United States president is presented with a decision. And I think Korea will have influence in that process because we'll be discussing, that Korea and the United States will be discussing our nuclear doctrine and how and in what cases nuclear weapons might be used. So that in that area, I think Korea will have influence and will have increased influence because of this process.
Now, Mr. Panda, Washington Declaration was the result of South Korean population's demand for nuclear weapons, considering the timeline of events and the timeline of what has been said so far. And it appears South Korea wants to highlight their stronger visibility in the nuclear decision-making process, while the U.S. dismisses excessive claims. Is the U.S. implying the U.S. will have control over the nuclear forces and wants South Korea to stay out of any nuclear decision and only support with conventional forces?
Well, look, so I think that's generally accurate, but that's how the U.S. treats all 30 plus of its allies, including NATO allies. NATO does have nuclear sharing, whereby the United States forward bases nuclear weapons in 5 NATO countries. That's an arrangement that predates the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But when it comes to South Korea, there's nothing that the United States imposes on South Korea in any way when it comes to these arrangements that's particularly unusual or suggests that the U.S. is treating Seoul in a lesser way than any of its allies. To the contrary, I would actually point out that the Washington Declaration has been viewed with envy in parts of Europe, for instance, where there are increasingly now new demands from countries like Poland, for instance, for the U.S. to forward deploy nuclear weapons and to bring some of what the U.S. has given to South Korea over to Europe. So the grass can sometimes seem greener depending on one's vantage point on some of these issues. But I think the fundamental point I would make about the Washington Declaration is one of the innovations in the Washington Declaration, alongside the announcement of the Nuclear Consultative Group, is the fact that President Biden indicated that he would make every effort to consult President Yoon prior to any decision to use nuclear weapons. And I think that's incredibly significant. The U.S. has not made that type of a direct statement in a comparable document in the past, and so I think that does show that the U.S. is quite sensitive currently to South Korea's interest in being consulted prior to any decision to use nuclear weapons. The final point that I would make on this issue around the Washington Declaration is that you described it as a response to growing South Korean interest in nuclear weapons. And I do think that's partly true, but the Washington Declaration is fundamentally a two-way exchange of assurances. The reason the Washington Declaration, for instance, includes language on South Korea's legal commitments on non-proliferation is essentially because the document is an assurance from South Korea to the United States as well that Seoul will continue to see extended deterrence as sufficient and not pursue nuclear weapons in contravention of its legal commitments.
Mm-hmm. Realistically, though, considering the geography of where North Korea is located, right next to China and right next to Russia, what U.S. has promised that in its nuclear posture review, what President Biden has reaffirmed, that to retaliate on North Korea, if North Korea uses nuclear weapons on the United States or its allies, it would mean the end of the regime. But that kind of nuclear retaliation scenario, could that really be carried out considering the geography of North Korea?
So look, I think a lot of this will be scenario specific. And the language on ending the regime actually doesn't appear in the Washington Declaration. The language in the Washington Declaration is that if North Korea uses nuclear weapons, the alliance will respond in a swift, effective, and overwhelming way. And I actually prefer that formulation because it does allow for a certain degree of flexibility. I think it's generally not a good idea for the United States and South Korea to tie ourselves to a specific course of action given the number of contingencies that might play out in the real world. Certainly there are scenarios where we can imagine wide-scale use of nuclear weapons by North Korea against South Korean civilian population. I have absolutely no doubt in that case that the United States would be willing to respond with any and all means necessary, including nuclear weapons. But some of the other scenarios that the alliance, I think, should be discussing at organizations like the Nuclear Consultative Group are certainly more gray in nature. And South Korea and the United States could both come to reason that nuclear weapons might not be the right tool for the job in all of these contingencies. Above all, the primary concern for the alliance, I think, continues to be deterrence of North Korea's limited coercive activities of non-nuclear lethal attacks, preventing the repeat of what we saw in 2010 on the Korean Peninsula when North Korea sank a South Korean ship and shelled a South Korean island, potentially leading to conflict. And those types of scenarios are, I think, what the two sides need to be discussing discussing, and also fully understanding the range of contingencies that might manifest on the Korean Peninsula.
Ambassador Zumwalt, didn't United States promise South Korea in its nuclear posture review and during the press conference right after the Biden-Yoon summit here in Washington, D.C., that if North Korea uses nuclear weapons, it will mean the end of the regime?
I think yes. I think the point of this statement is deterrence. We want North Korea to have no doubt that the consequences for using nuclear weapons would be catastrophic. And for that reason, I think this enhanced dialogue between South Korea and the United States is very, very important to make it very clear to North Korea that there's no doubt that using nuclear weapons would be catastrophic. And the whole point of this is to deter North Korea from considering such use.
Mr. Panda, North Korea criticized the International Atomic Energy Agency for assuring the safety of treated radioactive water from the Fukushima nuclear plant. Is North Korea in a place to criticize other countries? When we think about North Korea's nuclear testing sites, considering their poor safety rules, considering their radioactive pollution, what is North Korea to say about other countries?
Also, on some level, that is an opportunistic criticism. Based on the technical evidence, based on the IAEA's appraisal of Japan's filtering of the contaminated water at Fukushima, I personally have no concerns about the release of that water. Regarding North Korea, though, North Korea's credentials certainly here, I agree, are not very good to criticize a country like Japan. But when it does come to North Korea's own practices at their nuclear test site, with the exception of the first nuclear test, they've actually been quite good at preventing the venting of radionuclides. And the reason I know that is because the U.S. actually looks for those signatures to better understand the design of North Korea's nuclear warheads. And so the North Koreans actually have strong incentives to ensure that when they do test nuclear weapons, none of those radionuclides actually vent into the atmosphere, because that can provide intelligence agencies with valuable information about the precise isotopes that North Korea might be using in its nuclear weapons designs.
Dr. Olli Heinonen, a former IAEA leader, told VOA that the tunnels that North Korea uses for nuclear tests, the radioactive material stays in that tunnels, it doesn't go away, and it could stream into the rivers.
There is that possibility, especially as the Punggye-ri nuclear test site does see heavy rainfall, as all of North Korea does, particularly in the summer months. And so the possibility of some of that contamination escaping is a possibility, but that's significantly more limited than the kind of mass radionuclide venting that you would see in a nuclear test that, let's say, was improperly contained in an underground nature.
Ambassador Zumwalt, with continued criticism coming from some segments of South Korea, even with the release of the IAEA report, are there concerns that some segments of South Korea are politicizing this scientifically proven incident from an agency that's internationally renowned in this area, which went through global safety standards?
Well, you're right that the International Atomic Energy Agency is renowned for being a very impartial oversight agency that relies on scientific evidence. South Korea has a very long-standing and close relationship with the IAEA because the IAEA has been helping South Korea develop its civilian nuclear power capabilities. So there is a very good personal relationship between IAEA staff and South Korean experts. They know each other, and I think South Korea trusts the IAEA's expertise when it comes to South Korea's own civilian nuclear power sector. So my hope is that these Korean experts who know and trust the IAEA will work hard to explain to the South Korean public the results of the IAEA's efforts in order to assuage these concerns.
But other than those experts, South Korean politicians from the main opposition party says that IAEA report is more likely to be customized for Japan than objective report, more likely to be a political report than scientific report, and they also talk about a lot of Japanese capital flowing into IAEA, therefore they cannot trust IAEA. What would you respond to those claims?
I think South Korea, as a major, having one of the world's largest civilian nuclear power sectors, undermining the authority and the credibility of the IAEA is not in South Korea's own interest.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week, Mr. Panda. Ambassador Zumwalt, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.